Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the IISS. My name is Maya Nouwens. I am the Research Fellow for Chinese Defense Policy and Military Modernization within the Defense and Military Analysis Program here at IISS. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's talk, which is the first under the banner of the China Security Project, as you can see behind me. China Security Project is a new endeavor between the IISS and MERICS, which is an institute in Berlin focused on Chinese studies, and was launched in October 2017. So the China Security Project seeks to combine the two strengths of our institutes, soft power analysis and hard power analysis. Today, actually on your seat, you will have found two publications. The first one is a research paper that Helena and I have written on Chinese defense patents. And the second is the China
Global Security Tracker.
The China Global Security Tracker, which is a biannual publication that monitors developments in Chinese security landscapes. And the focus of this tracker is actually the focus of today's talk. So we're all familiar with Chinese global power projection abroad or hard power assets. What some of us might be less familiar with is Chinese domestic politics. So Helena today will help us elucidate on what has been happening in Chinese domestic politics post-19th Party Congress, particularly in the Central Military Commission. And if I introduce Ms. Helena Legarda, she is the research associate at the MERICS Institute for Chinese Studies in Berlin, focusing mainly on Chinese foreign and security policy, and she's previously worked at research institutes and the European Union representation in Beijing. She holds a Master in Public Policy from Harvard Kennedy School of Government and a BA in Chinese Studies from the University of Oxford. So before I give the floor to Helena, the way that this will work today is that there will be time for a Q&A after her talk. Please hold your questions until then. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Maya, for the kind introduction. And as Maya said, this presentation is based on the focus topic of the China Global Security Tracker, of which you have a copy on your seats. As she said, a lot of people like to focus on the new equipment that the PLA gets or new developments in activities overseas, etc. So what I'm looking to do here is to... Just going to give them a couple of minutes. There you go. What I'm looking to do here is to look into the military reforms that have happened domestically, mostly to do with structure, and also look at the political culture inside the PLA in China, and also look at how that has changed under Xi Jinping when compared to previous party leaderships. So what I will try to show is that Xi announced very early on in his tenure his intention of strengthening party control of the People's Liberation Army, but what we have seen under him has actually been a personalization of control. So we've moved from collective party leadership over the armed forces to a very personalized leadership under Xi. So this first slide shows the first round of structural reforms of the PLA that took place in late 2015. They were announced mostly on December 31st, 2015. So we can see in this graphic the former military regions were changed and reorganized into regional theater commands. The 4 general departments of the Central Military Commission that are up there in blue were broken up into 15 smaller organizations under the direct control of the Central Military Commission leadership, of which Xi is the chairman. The ground forces were downgraded and turned into a regular military service, and a new strategic support force was created. I don't know if you can read it very well, but it's the fifth one, the one at the bottom on the right-hand side, with the goal of centralizing cyber and space capabilities that were before quite dispersed. So all of these reforms were actually announced in 2013. So shortly after Xi took office, he actually announced that he was planning on enacting major reforms of the PLA. And his idea from the start was to strengthen the role of the party, to put the party very firmly in control. And this came on the back of a major corruption scandal inside the PLA when former Vice Chairman Xu Caiho and Guo Boxiong were arrested for allegedly running a massive corruption ring by which all promotions inside the military were up for sale. So Xi announced his intentions very early on. He was going to put the party firmly in control. He was going to launch a major anti-corruption campaign. And this was one of his first steps to do exactly that. He broke up the former 4 general departments that were incredibly powerful. He put the Central Military Commission leadership in control. And he downgraded the ground forces that were, again, very powerful and basically running the show earlier on, and put them on par with the other military services. So now to the 19th Party Congress, which is when we saw the next major round of reforms. 19th Party Congress is held the Party Congress in general is held every 5 years. This one was held in October 2017. And at the Party Congress, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, in this case Xi, always delivers a work report to all the attending CCP delegates. These reports don't normally include concrete policy initiatives. They sort of look back on what they've done in the previous 5 years, and then they outline some priorities for the next 5 years. Again, nothing very specific, but it does help us see where the country is going to go in the near future. So in the section on national defense and the military, Xi outlined these priorities. Loyalty to the party, again, number one, as he announced several years before. So this is not a surprise. Loyalty to the party, combat capabilities and efficient joint operations meaning operations in cooperation between all of China's military services, not with foreign militaries, and civil military integration to continue with the modernization of the army. And the ultimate goal of Xi is for full modernization of the PLA to be achieved and basically completed by 2035, and for the PLA to be a so-called world-class force by 2049. And this date is actually very significant. 2049 corresponds to one of Xi's centenary goals. So 2049 will mark the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, and Xi has committed and vowed that by then China will have become a strong, democratic, civilized, harmonious, and modern socialist country. Very symbolic, long phrase, basically meaning any major reforms that we're implementing now all have to be done by then. So how does this compare to the previous national defense and goals when it comes to the military? So here's a brief comparison between what Hu Jintao, which is the former party general secretary, said in 2012, so the previous party congress, and what Xi said now. And we see a very clear shift from a focus almost exclusively on modernization and equipment development to political loyalty and making the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, able to operate overseas. So, Hu said that we must make major progress in modernizing national defense and the armed forces and talked about mechanization. Xi very clearly spoke of making the PLA into world-class forces that obey the party's command, can fight and win, and maintain excellent conduct. All in all, a highly political agenda, quite clearly. In Xi's mind, in Xi's sort of view of the PLA, tightening the party's control over the armed forces is a precondition for building a powerful army. Without the party firmly in control, tackling corruption issues and what is often called factionalism inside the army, the PLA will never be a real successful military. So again, party loyalty, top of the list. What we also saw at the 19th Party Congress, as I will introduce in a minute, is a major reform of the Central Military Commission, which is the body that is in charge of the People's Liberation Army. A lot of people were caught by surprise by this. However, the changes didn't come out of the blue. Xi had been hinting at plans to reshuffle the Central Military Commission and overall the whole army top brass for months. So this is only some change in 2017 hinting at the fact that this was going to happen. So before the Congress, between January and roughly September, the commanders of the 4 military services, the commanders of 3 out of the 5 regional command theaters, and the heads of most of the Central Military Commission departments, the 15 ones that I told you about earlier, had been replaced. So major changes coming. In August, 2 Central Military Commission members, Fan Fenghui of the Joint Staff Department and Chang Yang from the Political Work Department, were replaced and then immediately vanished. And the rumors that they were under investigation for corruption, but for a while without any confirmation. They simply disappeared off of the public eye. Some have called this a purge. I guess you can make an argument in that direction, no problem. And another sign of changes to come is that 90% of the names in the list of military delegates to the party Congress released in September were first-time delegates. 90%. That is quite unprecedented and very significant because the military members of the Central Committee and of the Central Military Commission are pulled out from this list. So again, major changes coming. Xi was definitely about to reshuffle the structure of the Central Military Commission and simply the leadership of the PLA. Also interesting about this list, the 2 Central Military Commission members that disappeared a couple of months earlier were not on the list, effectively confirming that they were under investigation. Therefore, by the time of the Congress, when the Congress was coming up, it was clear that major changes were coming to the leadership of the PLA. What was unclear is what exactly these would look like. So this is the old Central Military Commission. 11 members, Xi as the chairman, Fan Chanlong and Su Ziliang as vice chairman, so 2 vice chairmen, and 8 members representing the head of the Ministry of Defense, the directors of the former 4 general departments, and then the commanders of what used to be the 3 military services, keeping in mind that the ground forces were separate and under direct control of the Central Military Commission. This is what things looked like right before the 19th Party Congress in October. Fan Fenghui and Chang Yang were detained, and the 5 people shaded in gray here were people who had reached the unofficial retirement age of 68. So they could not stay on for another term. So Xi was playing with 3 people who would most likely stay on the commission, and then he had a lot of room to maneuver to either bring new people in or restructure, basically to change this to his liking. We still couldn't really figure out what the new Central Military Commission would look like because the Central Military Commission actually includes positions, not people. So it's not people that get promoted to the Central Military Commission, it's positions. So the Logistics Support Department Director is in the Central Military Commission, whoever that is. So there was a clear possibility that what could happen is that simply these positions would remain represented and the people who were replacing the people who were retiring or detained would just occupy their spot. However, Xi surprised everyone. And he unveiled a much, much smaller 7-member Central Military Commission without any commanders of the military services. And he also dropped 2 of the former general departments, the Logistics Support Department and the Equipment Development Department, which could be a sign of priorities for him. So you can see the Political Work Department still has a spot on the Central Military Commission. And interestingly, the secretary of the Discipline Inspection Commission of the Central Military Commission is for the first time a member of the commission. Again, very political move. As you can see, out of the 4 members, 2 are of the political branch of the PLA, Political Work Department, and then Discipline Inspection Commissions. What was also very unusual is some of the promotions. So Xi actually ignored certain established rules for promotion into the Central Military Commission with a couple of these people. Normally, military officers are expected to have 3-star rank, so general or admiral, and what used to be called military region leader grade. You know, the PLA has a double system of rank and grade. So you need to be sort of at the top to be able to get into the Central Military Commission. And they also have to be members of the party central committee. There's two people here that skip those rules. So Li Tuocheng of the Joint Staff Department, second from the left in the members, and Chang Shenming, the last one on the right from the Discipline Inspection Commission. Neither of them were members of the 18th Central Committee, and Chang Shenming was even promoted to general after the party congress, a month later. He was not a full general by the time he made it up to the commission, which is not unprecedented. This has happened before, but it's definitely unusual. It definitely signals what Xi's priorities are when it comes to the current Central Military Commission. So, what do the characteristics of the new Central Military Commissions tell us about Xi's defense priorities? And what we can see is that they very clearly match the ones that he outlined in his work report to the Party Congress. So again, loyalty to the party and to Xi himself remain absolutely at the top of the list. Xi basically stacked up the commission with his allies, both through people who owe him personally their career progression, like these two I just mentioned, who basically got helicoptered in, and also by promoting people who have some sort of past personal connection to him. So there's people here like Miao Hua, this one here, the third one on the left, who worked with Xi in Fujian when they were both in the province. And another one of the members, Zhang Youxia, one of the vice chairman, his father actually served with Xi Jinping's father during the Civil War. So there's some personal connections there. We also see, obviously, a clear focus on anti-corruption. And again, political work, as I mentioned, with the inclusion of the Secretary of the Discipline Inspection Commission. So what we are starting to see here is a shift from collective leadership of the military by the party to personalization of power. So Xi Jinping is starting to put himself in control more than just the party overall. So we're starting to see the shift here, and this is one of the first clear signs. Other characteristics that, again, match very well with Xi's priorities, jointness, as it's often called in China, and inter-service cooperation. We have the four traditional military services represented in the Central Military Commission, and the first-ranked vice chairman is actually an Air Force general, which is highly unusual because that's a position very often reserved for ground force generals. And then the ability to fight and win wars. As you probably all know, Chinese troops in general have little to no combat experience, with China having fought basically no wars in the last few decades. However, Xi has managed to get two people on the commission who have some combat experience in the China-Vietnam War of 1979. And those would be Zhang Youxia, second-ranked vice chairman, and Li Tuocheng, Joint Staff Department director. We can discuss to what extent they actually do have combat experience. It's quite unclear what kind of role they had during the war itself, but they were there, they were deployed. So again, the ability to fight and win wars is clearly still a priority for Xi. So that's what we saw during the Party Congress, and now to what we've seen since the Party Congress. And what we've seen is, since Xi hinted at the personalization of authority, we've seen a move towards that. Since the Party Congress, which was mid to late October. So we're talking about 3.5 months here, not 3 years. So his success in consolidating his personal control has been actually quite remarkable. First, right after the Party Congress, right off the bat, Xi managed to get, one, his defense priorities, and two, the Xi Jinping thought on strengthening the military into the party constitution, which gives both of these things a lot more policy weight. That's now in the CCP constitution. Xi also demanded, right after the Party Congress, that the new Central Military Commission and the PLA as a whole pledge loyalty to him. And the new military leadership obliged almost immediately, and they issued a statement that included that sentence that is in the headline up there. The PLA should follow Xi's command, answer his orders, and never worry him. Personalization of power quite clearly. And the Central Military Commission also issued a new opinion, which is an official document, vowing to implement the chairman responsibility system, which I will introduce in a minute, but it basically means that every decision to do with national defense of the military has to be made by the chairman of the Central Military Commission, i.e. Xi Jinping himself. In January, we saw the People's Armed Police transfer under the sole control of the party Central Military Commission, when before it was under dual control of the State Council and the Central Military Commission. You could think, well, symbolic move, right? The line between party and state in China is quite blurry. Even when it was under State Council and Central Military Commission, it was probably still run by the party and the Central Military Commission. The difference here is that the People's Armed Police, there was a few high-profile cases recently of local leaders trying to use the People's Armed Police for their own purposes. The most high-profile one is when Po Xilai, the disgraced former leader of Chongqing, tried to mobilize the PAP to arrest his police chief when he tried to seek shelter at the U.S. consulate. So some fears among the central leadership that some local leaders or some factions inside the party could use the People's Armed Police to oppose Xi's authority. The solution? Move them. Put them right under him. Also in January, new military training regulations for the whole of the People's Liberation Army. Again, based on Xi Jinping's thought on the military. And a couple of weeks later, yet a new Central Military Commission regulation establishing full-time inspection teams for the military to root out corruption and behavior that is not befitting of party members, which includes criticizing the leadership of the party or of Xi Jinping. And again, with this new regulation, they committed to implementing the trauma responsibility system, which now is everywhere. Now I'm going to discuss a little bit this German responsibility system. The content, I think, is quite clear. All significant issues to do with national defense, army building, anything military must be planned and decided by the CMC chairman. Although the concept was included in the Chinese constitution in 1982, it's been largely unimplemented since. Official media even spoke of a vice chairman responsibility system under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, by which the civilian chairman of the commission would basically take a step back and leave his and let his uniformed vice chairman kind of run the management of the armed forces. This is changing. The concept re-emerged in 2014. Xi reintroduced it in the run-up to a political work conference of the whole army that was that took place in November 2014, the Kutian conference, in which Xi basically mentioned this principle again, and he's been pushing for it very hard ever since. And what these developments have shown, the ones that I showed you right before, during the party congress and since, is that Xi has been very successful in formalizing and institutionalizing this concept. It before existed only on paper. Now he's managed to get the whole of the PLA and the PLA leadership to commit to implementing this. And this sort of follows on Xi getting somehow bestowed the title of Commander-in-Chief a couple of years ago. So again, further signs of personalization of authority. And now I'm just going to very quickly conclude with some of the, what I think are the implications. What we've seen in the run-up to the party congress, during and after, with all these reforms, is that Xi has been remarkably successful in consolidating the party's control over the PLA, and more than that, his own control of the PLA. And with him so firmly in control, we can expect to see his priorities of sort of combat readiness, political work, and inter-service cooperation to continue. These goals are not going anywhere, so we can expect to see China continue to invest very heavily in modernization of the PLA and to increasingly operate overseas to gain real operational experience. The anti-corruption campaign inside the military, that is also most likely going to continue in full force. And to finish off, right before we open the floor for Q&A, I want to leave you with that quote. Xi Jinping, in his work report to the 19th Party Congress: party, government, military, civilian, and academic, east, west, south, north, and center, the party leads everything. So I'm going to just leave it there, and I'll be taking your questions in a minute.
Well, thanks very much for an excellent talk. I think the way that we would do this is that if you please raise your hand if you have a question and introduce yourself, that would be wonderful. Before you do, sir, I might take the first question as chair and just pick up on this point, Elena, about the military and combat experience of two members of the CMC. To what extent, first of all, do we know what this combat experience is? And second of all, to what extent does that help Xi pursue a PLA that can fight and win wars?
So we don't actually have a lot of information about to what extent they have real combat experience, or whether they were just simply deployed to the area when the war was happening. They were involved for sure. It's just unclear what role they had. But I think it's largely symbolic. I think it's Xi's way of expressing that having a military that is able to fight wars is important and should be a priority, which is something that, to be fair, should not surprise anybody. If you have a massive military, you want it to be able to operate efficiently and effectively. But I think it's largely symbolic.
We have one question here. Thank you.
It's Masato Kimura, a Japanese journalist. My question is about the future of One Belt and One Road and Indo-Pacific led by US and Japanese dynamics in your view.
That's a broad question. Are you asking about the security implications or just overall? Wow. So, I mean, I can just tell you very briefly what my personal opinion is on this. I don't work exclusively on the Belt and Road, so take everything with a pinch of salt. But to my mind, what's quite clear is that the Belt and Road is also Xi's signature foreign policy project, that the project is also not going anywhere, it's going to continue, it's becoming more and more institutionalized, and you're having higher numbers of Chinese companies, of Chinese people, of Chinese citizens, and of Chinese funds going overseas. And that, of course, also means that they're facing more and more threats and dangers, especially because the Belt and Road goes through some highly unstable countries. So somebody will have to provide security for those companies, for those investments, for those people. Whether the PLA will be deployed, personal opinion, in the next few years, no. I think we're more likely to see private security firms being sent over, Chinese private security firms being sent over to protect these investments. I don't think we're going to see the PLA deploying overseas for this purpose in the near future. If we're looking more medium to long term, I think it's a possibility.
Yes.
Hi, thanks. I had a question in the Foreign Affairs Committee. Thank you for your excellent talk. It's really interesting. Just picking up on that last point and on your last bullet point there where you mentioned increased operations overseas, I just wondered if you could expand on what you do see that as being, what that means in real terms.
Sure. So what China's been doing when it comes to operations overseas in the last few years is mostly centered around military operations other than war. So we've seen China up its participation in UN peacekeeping operations. We've seen humanitarian teams being deployed. We've seen medical teams being deployed, mostly to African countries. We've also seen a lot of joint exercises, but very often joint exercises overseas. You probably all remember the one in the Mediterranean with Russia, followed by the one in the Baltic Sea, again with Russia. So China is definitely moving closer and closer to Europe and away from the Asia-Pacific region. But so far, we haven't seen a lot of boots on the ground with the combat purpose. What we're also seeing is an expansion of China's kind of logistics network overseas. The base in Djibouti being the best example. There's now unconfirmed rumors that China is in talks to open another base in either Pakistan or Iran. Talks that China may open a base in Afghanistan in the Wakhan corridor. And of course, there's a lot of ports along the way that China uses as logistics bases, as sort of dual-use ports, but it doesn't own. So we're probably going to see a lot more on that. And normally the way this works in most cases, Djibouti was an exception, but you've got Chinese state-owned companies going in, there's a major investment, they end up managing the port, and then there are some visits by PLA Navy ships. So the port effectively turns into a bit of a dual-use port, even if it's not a military base per se. So we're probably going to see a lot more on that. I also expect China to maintain its contributions to UN peacekeeping operations or even increase it, because it's the one way the central leadership has of giving its troops some operational experience, even if it's not directly in combat. It's a useful way for Chinese troops to learn to operate overseas and to sort of collaborate with foreign militaries.
A question in the back, Tom.
Yeah, I'm Tom Morgan, I'm an analyst at the Institute of Mayor. A couple of questions, that's all right. You talked about some of the reforms relating to the creation of the support force, as well as the sort of relative downgrading of the ground forces. I was wondering if there were any developments regarding the rocket force, and also if you had any thoughts on perhaps contradiction between centralising things a bit more under Xi Jinping and making it more of a warfighting force, if more of the decision making is being sent to the centre as opposed to how much of it's on the margins of
thank you for these questions. They're very interesting. I think when it comes to the rocket force, there haven't been any major structural changes to it. What has happened, though, is that the rocket force has become increasingly important. So there's a lot of investment that's gone into it, into developing new missile systems, etc. Especially with the North Korea threat becoming more prominent and the THAAD being deployed in South Korea, China's become more concerned. So it's pouring money into the rocket force, and there's been a lot of collaboration under the banner of civil-military integration with some private companies, state-owned companies mostly, in developing new missile systems, etc. But structurally, I don't think there's been anything major when it comes to the rocket force. As for the contradiction between centralizing power and creating a war-fighting force, I agree. I think that contradiction exists. I think undersea in general, in policy, even moving beyond the security arena, we've seen a re-centralization of power. And what that has meant is that the localities have a lot less leeway to experiment and to sort of implement different policies. And that applies to security as well. In theory, the Central Military Commission would sort of run the kind of bigger picture issues, and then the headquarters of the military services are the ones that should be in charge of training and of inter-service cooperation and of the day-to-day management of the troops. In practice, I'm uncertain as to how this is working, and I wouldn't be too surprised if this re-centralization meant that there's some trouble when you go lower down the ranks.
Okay, we had a question at the front.
Hi, I'm Shao from Chinese Embassy. I just want to ask a question concerning the U.S. The recently released reports, such as the National Security Strategy, which labeled China and Russia as like rivals or competitors. And I just want to know how do you look at these kind of labels, and whether what do you think from the UK or the European countries, are they going to follow this kind of assessment, or do they think differently?
Well, first disclaimer: I am not American, so I'm speaking from a bit of a distance. I mean, I think everybody in this room knows how the current American administration got to this point and why this language was used. Also, this language is not really a surprise. The American defense and security community has been talking about China as a rival for years. This is not news. I think when it comes to the European perspective, I think there is a bit of a difference. Europe simply doesn't have as much of a security and military presence in the region. And simply that geographical distance means that a lot of European countries, when it comes to military issues, don't see China as much of a rival. Personally, I think that when it comes to military issues, probably the most interaction that European militaries have with China is through UN peacekeeping operations, where they are very often deployed together. But European countries, most of them at least, don't have military bases in Korea or in Japan or in Southeast Asia. So simply the relationship is different. I don't think you can completely compare how the US portrays China or how Europe thinks of China. They're just completely different circumstances, completely different conditions.
We had a question in the front row.
David Ramsden, member of the Institute. Tomorrow we're discussing the United States nuclear posture review. Is there any indication that the Commission or China has been conducting a similar review of its nuclear?
Nothing public that I know of. I wouldn't be surprised if it had happened. I'm pretty sure these posture reviews happen quite regularly, as with any country, but they tend to not be made public. We don't have a lot of information on that. So nothing I can share on whether China has changed its posture. Officially and publicly, China's nuclear posture hasn't changed. No first use ever. They reserve the right to retaliate if attacked first. Bottom line, it's basically that. And if you ask any Chinese official or read any official document, that's basically what comes through. Whether that has changed behind the scenes, I'm afraid I can't say.
In the back, Ben.
I'm Ben Barry, I'm from the Institute. Can I make a couple of observations that I think bear on potential weaknesses? I think everybody welcomes the way China has steadily stepped up to the plate and increased its participation in UN missions. But when there was a recent flare-up of violence in South Sudan, where by and large most contingents in the UN mission retreated to their bases, emphasised force protection, and there are all sorts of outrages committed as a result, one of the contingents that appears to have done that is China. Now, is that a symptom of caution amongst the commanders there? Is it a symptom of force protection being the first priority of that Chinese contingent? But I think that what this illustrates is that there's going to be real tension between combat effectiveness, loyalty to the party, and centralisation. Because all the evidence of successful military operations over the last 100 years is that to exploit the potential of ever improved military equipment, commanders at every level have got to show initiative, daring, flair, and what you want is combat entrepreneurs, not peacetime bureaucrats. But centralisation and loyalty will inevitably be a comfort zone for peacetime bureaucrats. Now, this is a problem in all armed forces everywhere. It's a truth that should be universally acknowledged. But the other problem that comes from this is if you're a bright, sparky, entrepreneurial, active young man or woman in China, where you're going to be able to be more entrepreneurial and dynamic is in business. So I think that's going to be a really difficult issue. And if you want a warning from history, it's the Soviet armed forces. In the early 30s, they were actually possibly the most innovative armed forces in the world. But the purges, reinforced loyalty, took out a whole load of talent. And then in the Second World War, they actually had to bring survivors out of the Gulag and, make the best use of them. Which led to their operational success, but then loyalty was clamped down again on Stalin afterwards. And it seems to me that that's a fundamental contradiction that, the Chinese military need to close with and manage?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think that tension is there. I think it's a major problem to not allow commanders to take the initiative. And again, how decisions are made during operations is a little unclear, but I wouldn't be too surprised if no commander deployed in the South China Sea was able to do anything without first calling up Beijing, or at least the headquarters of the regional command theater. Wouldn't be too surprised if that was exactly how this worked. So, of course, that tension is there. I completely agree. And I think it's going to be problematic in the future. What we need to watch is what happens after Xi Jinping ends his next 5 years and with the next person. Will this continue? Will this change again? That's all to be determined. We can't say that now. So we'll see. But definitely that's a problem, and it will remain a problem. And it will worsen the more that China wants to operate overseas, and the more that it wants to do outside of its outside of its comfort zone. When it comes to violence in South Sudan and the comment about the peacekeepers, I'm afraid I don't have a very good answer as to why China did that. I think it's probably a combination of things. It's probably policy, force protection. It's probably fear that public opinion may get a little unhappy about China sending so many soldiers overseas and then not being able to protect them. It could simply be caution. The troops deployed there don't have any combat experience, and we don't want to put them in the line of fire. So I think it could be a combination of things. But what I can tell you is that when you read Chinese media regularly, a lot of articles come out every time that Chinese peacekeepers are engaged in any sort of minor clash or confrontation while deployed in a peacekeeping mission. So they do make an effort to kind of publicize that and to sort of make people feel proud that Chinese troops are doing their job and that they are engaged in some sort of skirmish in Sudan or in any of the... I think China right now has troops in 10 UN missions. So they're proud of that, and they do publicize it a lot. So as to why that happened in South Sudan, probably a combination of things.
We had a question waiting second row.
Yeah. You mentioned centralization and loyalty to Xi Jinping. Sorry, I had to come from The Economist. You mentioned centralization and loyalty to Xi Jinping. I can see how that's stabilizing while Xi Jinping's in power. Mm-hmm. But doesn't it make the transition from one leader to the next harder? Because the new leader has to re-establish loyalty.
Yes, absolutely. It makes it a lot harder. There's a lot of rumors floating around that Xi Jinping may not step down in 5 years. So you could take this as evidence if you wish. I'm not sure this serves as evidence of that. So far, there's no clear indication that Xi doesn't plan to step down. So we'll just assume that he is in 5 years. This is a problem. It's centralization of power in the party, maybe not so much of a problem. Personalization of power in the figure of Xi himself, that's a major issue. If you stack up the Central Military Commission with people that you're personally close with or you have personal connections to that owe their loyalty to you, that becomes difficult when there's somebody else in charge. And this has happened before. If you remember the transition between Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, the Central Military Commission issue was complicated. Jiang Zemin actually didn't step down as chairman of the Central Military Commission for a little while after Hu was general secretary of the party. And there was a lot of commentary about how Hu Jintao was not in charge of the army at all, because Jiang Zemin had his people up there and who had no control. So this has happened before, and we could definitely see a repeat of that with the next person when there's a new transition of power. This is a major issue, and it will be a major issue in 5 years' time. So this works now. This works for Xi. We'll see after, but I expect problems.
There we go.
Yeah, so one of the main takeaways from the 1950 Congress is that Xi is probably going to bring up the Chinese forces on par with the US by 2050. However, if we see the status quo of the Chinese forces, it's starkly in contrast to that. It's heavily dependent on Russian arms. The spearhead of its air forces is made up of Su-35s. Its larger amount of its aircraft are mock-up versions of the Su-24s, and its air defenses are made up of the S-400s. Even its fifth-generation fighter jet uses a Saturn AL engine, which is produced by the Russians. How, in times of war, is China going to mass-produce this weapon system and wage a war?
So I think there's two things. One, Xi didn't say that he was going to bring the PLA on par with the US military by 2049. The PLA is going to be a world-class force. That is vague enough. I think it's not realistic to expect the PLA to be on par with the US military by 2049. But that there will be some major improvements, absolutely. And secondly, when it comes to sort of Chinese equipment development capabilities, etc. I mean, may I come back in here because we did write that report on defense patents. China is moving very fast at developing new equipment, and it's doing so domestically very often. You have a lot of Chinese SOEs and companies working on this, and Chinese reliance on imports of Russian arms has gone down quite substantially over the last few years. I don't know if you want to add something on that.
I think one other point to add would be when do we expect this to be necessary? When do we expect China to go to war or enter into a conflict? So I think from what Helena has presented, this is not something that we'll see anytime soon, and thus this is still something that China thinks it has time to work towards. That would be my answer. But good question, thank you. We had a question in the fourth row on the left. Yes, sir?
Mark Farrington, member of the right on the left. My question is also related to this objective of having military capability that can fight in the war. What do you think were the historical incidents that most informed and led to the adoption of this objective? And in its form, it's quite simplistic and abrupt and seems to imply criticism of historical allocation of resources. So what specific events do you think have driven it? And then secondly, what theater of war or size of conflict do you think they have in mind when they are making this declaration, and how are they going to measure whether they've achieved this objective in absence of an actual conflict where they can have an outcome?
So to your first question about the historical events, I'm not sure that what brought this about was any historical event. I think what we've seen is a shift in foreign policy and on China's and the central leadership's view of the world and of its position of the world in the world, and this is just sort of a logical next step. So we see a China that's a lot more confident. The new American administration has definitely given them a little bit more of a push by giving them a little more space to go abroad and to present itself as a leader. A China that is more involved than ever in the UN. We're not only talking peacekeeping operations, we're talking the Security Council, we're talking a lot of UN agencies. A China that is increasingly active in international fora, and a China that is just confident now. It's confident that it's powerful, that it can stand on its own, and that it needs to be more of a leader. And for that, China needs armed forces that match that are commensurate with its new international standing. So I think it's more of an ideological development that then applies to the military. I can't think of any specific historical event that I would say has driven this. And in terms of what kind of war they were thinking about, or what kind of conflict, I suspect they hope not to have to ever put this in practice, at least in the near future. Again, to my mind, this is more political and ideological. Is the idea that if China is a big, powerful country that is a leader in the international arena, in international politics, in foreign policy, it can't have a military that can't fight, which again makes sense, as I said before. I don't think they want to test this in the near future. I think they're probably thinking of some conflict in the region, in the Asia-Pacific region, if you ask me. I think that would be sort of how they would measure progress. So could we retake Taiwan if it comes down to that? Could we face any of the Southeast Asian countries in a territorial dispute? What would happen if the US got involved? So I think it's mostly regional conflicts that we are talking about, to my mind. But again, nothing official on this. This is just my view of the issue.
Third row on the right.
Yeah, hi, thanks for your talk. I've got two questions really. I think we would agree that she did take us by surprise on quite a few events throughout 2017, and particularly the speed that the two CMC members got removed. Do you feel as though there was something sort of more sinister behind the removal of the two individuals other than just purely corruption? And then my second point, with all these quite significant changes happening at the top, what's your sense of how the sort of lower echelons are feeling about this and the state of morale across the forces?
Sure, thank you for your questions. In terms of the two Central Military Commission members that were removed, we can only speculate about this. The official, so one of the two that were detained actually killed himself while under house arrest a couple of months back. And the only explanation we have about the investigation came from the article reporting his death. That basically said that he had been linked to the two disgraced vice chairmen, Su Tae-ho and Kuo Bo-seong, that were arrested a few years back for running this massive corruption ring inside the PLA. So that's the official explanation. It's corruption, they were linked to these two vice chairmen, and therefore they had to be removed. We don't have any more facts, so it's unclear. Could it be something more sinister? I guess it could be. I guess it could be a political purge. I guess it could be the two of them not getting on board with Xi's reforms and putting up a fight. I guess it could be Xi deciding that if they weren't to fall in line, they just needed to be out of the leadership. So there's a clear possibility that that's exactly what happened, but we don't know, and I don't think we'll ever know. But it is very possible, because the argument that they were linked to these two disgraced vice chairmen, it's shaky at best. So you had these two vice chairmen of the Central Military Commission charging for promotions inside the military. Fine. That went on for years. You're talking about pretty much the whole of the PLA leadership was involved in this. If they were promoted, especially fast, they paid. So they were complicit somehow. They may not have been running the show, but they were somehow complicit. A lot of the people that remain on the Central Military Commission were there at that time as well. So did they pay for the promotions? Maybe. So that argument that they were simply linked to these two, to my mind, a little shaky. So yes, it is possible that there was a bit of a political move on the part of Xi to kind of clear the way of opposition. But again, this is my personal view on the issue. We don't actually have any official facts. As for your second question on the state of morale among the lower echelons of the army, I actually can't say. This is not something that is ever discussed, really, in the media, etc. So all you get is articles about how happy the whole PLA is that Xi's in charge and he's so great and the reforms are so great and we're doing so great and we're all so happy and we eat better food now. But it's very difficult to gauge the actual state of morale when all you've got are these official statements that it's always a little unclear whether they are real or not, because they all tend to say kind of the same thing. So I am afraid I can't really give you an answer on what the lower levels of the army think about these changes.
So we have a question at the front here, and then at the back, sir.
Nicholas McLean, a couple of questions. One on international cooperation. One of the benefits of Chinese involvement in UN operations is, of course, also gaining experience of working with other countries, other people's armed forces. Could you give any feedback on how that's gone, both from China's point of view and point of view of partners, and similarly the cooperation for fighting piracy, naval cooperation? The second question is simply, could you give us some insight on how far China's improved its amphibious capabilities?
Sure, thank you. So in terms of Chinese involvement in UN operations and sort of the cooperation with other armed forces, the feedback has actually been quite good, both on Chinese media and from the other side. So a clear case is the counter-piracy operation in the Gulf of Aden. China, another disclosure, I'm actually Spanish. So the country that was running the EU Atalanta operation was actually Spain until recently. They maybe even still are. And there was a lot of cooperation between the EU mission and the Chinese deployment there. And the feedback has actually been quite positive. Similar goals, Chinese troops doing their job, the European troops doing their job, communicating quite regularly, a lot of visits from one ship to the other. They've held a couple of small joint drills. So pretty good feedback from both sides. China has also been doing this, so sending task forces to the region since 2008. So they've been at this for quite a while. Whereas when you look at UN peacekeeping operations, for many years, China actually only sent experts, not troops. So there we did see a bit of a shift a few years ago. When it comes to peacekeeping in other UN missions, so not the counter-piracy operation, I don't have as much information, but I do know that China does hold a lot of joint drills that seem to go pretty well with the peacekeeping, so deployments of other countries. So recently there was one, I think it was in Lebanon with French peacekeepers, that purportedly went quite well. They did something on demining some part of the country. And the feedback from both sides was quite good. But again, when it comes to UN peacekeeping, it's a little more opaque. There's not as much information. And your second question on amphibious capabilities, I mean, I don't work as much on hard powers. I think there's a lot of people here in the room from the Institute that can probably give you more information than I can. But as far as I know, yes, there's been major improvements. The PLA Navy basically unveils a new ship very often with amphibious capabilities, basically every 3 months. So they're churning those out fast. So to my mind, some pretty fast improvements. I don't know if Maya has any more information on this, or if there's anyone else in the audience that wants to add something.
Our senior fellow for maritime affairs is in the room today, so perhaps afterwards I'd be happy to introduce you, get some expert analysis on that. We had another, if you're ready, another question in the back, sir. Yes.
I'm Brigadier Krishnan, the military advisor from the High Commission of India. It's interesting to see how the world looks different when you see from different parts of the world. I've been reading, the Western literature on Chinese military modernization over the last 15, 20 years. And the West has been showing the mirror to China, showing the path as to how it should improve and overcome its weakness. And just have one question. Do you visualize Europe getting drawn into a conflict with China if US gets drawn into a conflict with China in South China Sea as well as in the Korean Peninsula?
That's a difficult question to answer. For starters, Europe is vague. So the EU doesn't have an army. So I guess depending on what kind of conflict it was, there is a chance that some European countries may join in. That would all highly depend on the circumstances. Who started the conflict? Why is this conflict happening? Which are the parties involved? when, like, there's just too many variables. But I guess, short answer, yes. I guess there is a possibility that some member states may get, like, dragged in, but I don't think that's by any means guaranteed. I don't think this means that if there was a conflict in the South China Sea, European countries would just go. I think there's too many variables to consider.
I just want a quick comment and one question. You talk about China's peacekeeping missions. I just want to add that we will recently establish a reserve force peacekeepers of 8,000 people, which are ready to be called into operations at any time. And in terms of South Sudan, somebody mentioned about the Chinese peacekeepers down there. Actually, they have very good exchanges with their British counterparts down there, such as establishing military hospitals or things like that. As for in light of the security situation in South Sudan, of course, they will take some necessary precautions after several deaths in skirmish. My question is concerning the future of the Korean nuclear and missile crisis. I don't know, because people now talk about some bloody nose operations or all sorts of options, and I see the people from South Korea down here. Yeah. So I don't know how you see as the options available for the Americans or the other countries, and what kind of prospect you see will be in the pipeline.
Thank you. Thank you for your comment, and that's a very big question. I think if I knew how to solve the problem, I probably wouldn't be sitting here today. But well, I mean, the options on the table, I don't think I need to explain this to anybody, are actually quite clear. Negotiations, sanctions, some sort of military operation, and then various combinations of those with different levels of one or the other. Which one the US will choose, that I'm afraid I can't give you an answer on. I think a lot of that depends on what North Korea does in the near future. A lot of that depends on the United States relations with South Korea and maybe with Japan. A lot of that depends on US and with China, of course. A lot of that depends on domestic US politics and the new administration. So I'm afraid I can't give you an answer as to what the US will do. From what I have read and from what I know, and I know there are some Americans in the room, so if you want to add something, feel free. A full-blown attack invasion of North Korea is very unlikely. It's probably not going to happen. There's been some talk of a bloody nose attack. I guess that could happen if they're. I mean, I assume that they've discussed all the options. So all the options have been on the table at some point, and they probably somehow still are.
Something off the table? Something maybe on the table. What about something under the table?
Well, I can't tell you what the Trump administration keeps under the table or off the table.
Maybe quickly, John, you have a question?
Muchísimas gracias. Two quick questions. One, given the publicly expressed concern of the People's Republic of China with potentially having to deal with a refugee crisis from North Korea were the regime to collapse or it become internally unstable, would you guess that the People's Liberation Army has a contingency plan to move north of the 38th parallel to create a cordon sanitaire within North Korea in order to contain internally displaced people from becoming refugees in China? And my second question is, when in March the next set of intramural consultations take place in China and the CMC rules are further clarified, would you expect that the head of the Strategic Rocket Forces that is currently anticipated becomes the defense minister? And would you believe that in the current organization of the CMC, the defense minister would be more than a spokesperson and actually a policy maker?
Thank you very much. Very interesting questions. In terms of, again, of the North Korea issue and China's concern with refugees, I mean, this is a major concern for China, as you mentioned. China is very worried about this. If the U.S. were to attack, if a conflict were to erupt, if North Korea were to collapse, the refugees won't cross the DMZ, most likely. They will try to go into China. I don't know if you've been to the region, but it's actually a pretty narrow river. It's not very difficult to cross. You can swim, no problem. In terms of whether the PLA has plans to sort of move into North Korea and try to kind of block the way, I suspect those plans exist. I also suspect they probably don't want to implement them. What I read recently is that the PLA has upped the defense of the border itself. So they've deployed more troops and they've set up more infrastructure along the border, with the goal probably being that precisely, to try and stop refugees from coming in. Were the regime to collapse, I think it is possible that China would try to move in. Refugees will be part of the rationale behind this. I suspect preventing South Korea or the US from moving up too far north would also play an important role in this. And to your second question about the Minister of Defense, I mean, everybody expects the former head of the rocket force, Wei Fenghe, to become the Minister of Defense. Traditionally, the Minister of Defense has been a member of the Central Military Commission. Wei Fenghe was actually already replaced as commander of the rocket force, so there's somebody there. So he right now it's floating a bit, and he's the only one of the members of the Central Military Commission that has no clear position. So it's very possible, it's very likely that it will be him. And yes, there's actually been a lot of talk, even on Chinese media, about whether this would mean that the Ministry of Defense would get a bit more of a say. Wei Fenghe, the head of the rocket force, does have apparently a good relationship with Xi Jinping. He's someone of Xi's confidence. They have an old connection. He was in the previous Central Military Commission, and he remains in the Central Military Commission. So therefore, their relationship with Xi is quite good. So there's definitely a chance that the Ministry of Defense will be given some sort of authority, a little authority, over possibly missile forces. That's what a lot of the commentary is saying. Whether this will happen or not, we're going to have to wait until the NPC in March, next month, but I guess it's a possibility.
A question in the back, sir?
My name is Karan Nadeem Pakistan, and I'm the Army advisor from Pakistan Commission. So I have a comment. Comment is that in your, while you were making a cross-reference to you made a reference that there is a talk between supposedly a military base between at Pakistan or Iran. Let me make it very clear here. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor is a bilateral flagship project under the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a $62 billion portfolio of projects, mainly on road infrastructure, railway lines, energy projects and the Gwadar port. At last, our neighbors India, Afghanistan and other countries in the United Kingdom, United States and the Europeans to come and invest along with the Chinese. Neither we have the desire nor there is a Chinese interest to build any military activity along the Pakistani coast. So let me be very, I should strongly, objectively comment that here. Second is this whole study. I just want to get a sense, I think the facts and figures that I think very well researched, but I want to get being a double advocate, that at the platform of Rusi, Chief of General Staff, Gavin Williamson at different forums, and other people at different forums at NATO and United States are asking, to give us more money to keep our alliances intact, keep us relevant, to modernize armed forces, and for that we try to create a conflict or a bogey or a reason, whatever you say. Previously, Russia was being presented as the threat, and everybody was being asked. I think now Russia and China are being put as a monster for keeping these alliances intact and keeping the armies more relevant and asking more money, 2% of the GDP or whatever, to modernize and ultimately benefit some. What's your take on that?
So let me see if I can clarify that. So your question is about the portrayal of China as a militaristic country, basically? Is that what you were trying to get at?
Why the China is being portrayed as kind of a threat? Is it because the other places people require policymakers require more input to get more money to keep the alliances intact and be more relevant?
Well, again, that's a very big question that is a little beyond the scope of this presentation, and there's a lot of possible answers to that because a lot of countries will have a different rationale for considering China a threat. I mean, I can give you a couple of bullet points that I'm sure you already know. You simply have a new country becoming more and more prominent and becoming more and more involved in international affairs, a country that has a different political system that is not to the liking of many in the international community, a country that is expanding its armed forces and becoming more involved overseas, and that, of course, it's concerning to many countries. I think it's fair to say that if you're a small country and suddenly you've got the Chinese military at your doorstep, you're at least going to think twice about it. Think why is this happening? So we could keep talking about this forever. I can't give you a direct answer as to why is China a threat. I can give you my personal opinion, which is that you've got China becoming more and more involved internationally, following certain principles and kind of ideological concepts that a lot of people in the international community don't agree with. You've got an expanding military that is operating overseas more and more. You've got the Belt and Road Initiative, which sounds good on paper, sure, but you also do have major Chinese investments in countries that then plunge them into debt. Infrastructure projects that are given almost exclusively to Chinese firms. So there's a lot of sources for concern, and this is not to say that China is the only country doing things that are concerning for other countries. It's not that China is the evil one in the world and everyone else is great. But of course China is doing things that are worrying for many countries, and they are very often worrying for different reasons.
Right, we have a question waiting in the back, sir.
Hi, Charlie Barton. My main claim to fame is that I was a colleague of Helena at the EU delegation. But I'm currently an associate fellow at UC and London Director of China Policy. Three quick questions and a comment. You talked about 90% of the delegates at the 19th Party Congress military being new. Do you happen to have the figure for the 18th Party Congress by way of contrast? Secondly, Zhang Li, I think it was 2015, did an article on a very interesting piece on 90 generals who've been removed. Do you have a current figure for how many she has changed in the last 5 years? And that sort of leads up to the question of, which was hinted at earlier, to what degree there's opposition to these enormous changes within the PLA, both in terms of personnel, leadership, regulations, etc. So those are the three questions. And my comment is, at the 19th Party Congress and the Centennial Goal 2049, China cannot be a strong, civilized, modernized socialist country if it's not reunited, which means it must retake Taiwan by 2049 if it's to achieve that condition. Xi, of course, will be in his 8th session as president of the party, secretary. But you might want to comment on LA and Taiwan.
Thank you. So the two figures that you asked me for, the 18th Party Congress figure and the number of generals that were removed.
It's a bit tough, sorry.
No, I do have it, but I can't get it off the top of my head. But I will get back to you on that because I did pull it out at some point. So I'll get back in touch. In terms of opposition inside the PLA, I mean, there's been a lot of rumors that there has been a lot of opposition, which is why there's been such a major reshuffle of PLA leadership. And there's been a major reshuffle of PLA leadership, but there's also been changes at lower levels. And I mean, what else could be the reason for so many commanders and generals to be replaced? So there's been a lot of discussion and commentary about the fact that a lot of this was probably politically motivated, that there was some opposition, that people weren't getting in line with Xi being completely in charge. Actual real evidence, I'm afraid I don't have any, as in most cases when it comes to what happens inside the PLA. And your comment about Taiwan and 2049, yeah, I guess that's a way of looking at it. I guess there is a possibility that there's some sort of soft deadline on dealing with the Taiwan issue by 2049, in the same way that that probably applies to Hong Kong. So are we going to see developments there? Possibly. Will there be an invasion of the island? I want to say no, but maybe I'm just being optimistic. I guess there is a possibility for sure that they will try to do something when it comes to the Taiwan issue, at least to make it appear as if there's movement by 2049.
A question on the fourth one?
Yes, thank you. Good morning. I'm Wolf Melbourne. So when you read the Chinese literature, there's a lot of discussion in military circles about there's sort of a finite period for the PLA to sort of modernize and transform. And a lot of that's sort of wrapped up in the larger discussion of strategic opportunity that China overall has. But there's an acknowledgement that China does face some demographic challenges in the long term fiscally, do you have a sense of where that time period or where the beginning to hit the wall of demographics, but at the same time also, there's a lot of discussion in the 19th Party Congress about the new contradiction, where you sort of have uneven development, and how China begins to play with its budgets, and how much right now with growing budgets for the PLA, when does that begin to stop? So sort of like your take on what time horizon does the PLA really have to continue its sort of expansion and modernization? And in a similar vein, I think what sometimes gets lost in looking at just at the PLA, there's a forgetfulness of that actually the bulk of, or the majority of funding for security actually goes towards internal security. And do you sort of see that similar out of balance between internal and external continuing into the future, or do you ever see that switching over to more external accounts?
Thank you. These are, again, very good questions. I mean, I think that the period to modernize, they've publicly come out and said that, 2035. They want to have literally, like this is a quote, basically completed the modernization of the armed forces by 2035. So if they stick to their deadline, that's the one. And then 2049 is when they want the PLA to become a world-class force, which is, it probably involves a lot more about sort of being able to operate overseas and being a little more combat capable. But modernization, 2035.
You see that lining up though with demographics, so it's sort of the percentage of Chinese citizens that are over 65. You see a correlation of 2035 to those demographic points where China begins to have to take care of an aging population, a more urban population. Do you see a lineup, or do you see some delta between what the documents say and what the demographic trends say?
So, I mean, I have to admit I haven't really looked at demographic studies and how exactly they match up with these timelines for the military, but I suspect that is a concern for sure. I mean, the demographic challenges in China are major, and they are starting to bite. It's a very rapidly aging society, and is only going to continue. I guess playing in China's favor here is that they want to reduce the size of the PLA. They are demobilizing people. So in that sense, it kind of matches somehow. And when you look at the budget, I guess it will eventually kind of flatten or even fall a little. I don't think we're going to see a change in the near future, a shift in the bulk of the budget from internal security to external security. I think internal security is still the priority. Very clearly, the Communist Party's top priority in anything is to keep itself in charge. So internal security comes first. I don't think we're going to see in the next few years, couple of decades, a shift to spending more on the military for overseas operations. I think For now, and barring major political changes inside the country, that's probably not going to happen. When it comes to the budget for the military, however, what's complicated is that the figures are opaque, right? Like the Chinese come out with their official figures, then normally CIPRI come out with their own, I think it's CIPRI that does its own estimate, and then the US Department of Defense comes out with its own estimate, and they never match. Neither of the three estimates ever match. The Chinese official figure, we just don't know what it includes, what categories it includes and which ones it doesn't. So we could see a drop, a substantial one, but that actually may not mean anything. So it's also a problem with the actual figure itself. If we don't have a breakdown of what exactly is included there, China could say, well, the budget for next year is actually decreasing 2%. And sure, that means less money is going into it, but the money could be coming from another bucket and through another budget, and we would just not know. At least using open source information.
Sorry, just to say the IISS also has its estimates on defense budgets, and I'd be happy to put you in touch with our research fellow that works on that. We had a question in the third row.
Oh, yeah. So my question is are the Chinese ready to, sort of aggressively sell their one-party system in contrast to the liberal democracy abroad? And are they ready to, use or deploy the PLA to promote or defend those interests of theirs?
Short answer to both your questions. For now, no. I don't think we're going to see in the near future China deploying the PLA, even less to protect its own political interest overseas. I mean, there's of course some situations in which we could imagine China deploying a contingent. If you've got Chinese citizens that are overseas because of Belt and Road projects and they get attacked and there's a number of casualties, I guess it's possible that the PLA will deploy a contingent to try and get citizens out. But an actual deployment to try and push for political priorities, to my mind, we're not going to see that in the near future. And I don't think China right now is in the business of selling its own one-party system. It's definitely trying to influence societies overseas. Merrick's just published a study actually on China's authoritarian influencing in Europe. And China's doing a lot, but it's not trying to sell its own party system. It's just trying to influence media and academia and the discourse to try and push for its own priorities, but it's not trying to impose.
Just I want to echo what the Pakistani High Commission, what he said about the One Belt, One Road initiative. I think in the case of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, I think it's not only a win-win for the two countries. It's a triple win because some British companies are involved in the project, even in Pakistan. And I think this is a demonstration of the welcome and the warmth from the international community. Even I think over the past few months, Japan, there is growing interest in the One Belt, One Road initiative. And secondly, you talk about the military budget. Of course, there are all sorts of speculations, and we have our white paper. I would like to call your attention to it. And the Chinese budget is also published during the NPC session each year. So maybe you have your own estimations in your report to be published next week. And thirdly, I want to ask you a question concerning the military balance, because I just want to know that for different countries, they are looking at it from different perspective, and I just want to know that how, according to your studies, do you see the military balance of the world? Is it changing, tilting, or what would you see as the trend in the future?
Thank you for your comments and for your question. I mean, again, I don't really focus on hard power as much, so assessing the military balance is a little beyond where I normally do. I think there's definitely changes. I think that's undeniable. I think simply by China sort of expanding its military and improving its capabilities, that's already a shift in the international arena. I guess it all depends on how you look at it. China still doesn't deploy much overseas. So when it comes to sort of access to the whole world and having a blue water navy, etc., I think the US is the dominant power, period. I think if you're trying to compare specific capabilities, then maybe you can see more of a change. But things are definitely shifting. I don't think we've seen a reversal. I don't think that's coming in the near future, but that there's a shift underway, sure.
Okay, we have one last question in the back. Sir.
Yes, my name is Matt Lott, concerning a member of the Institute. I wanted to ask with regards to the comments you made about Djibouti, Iran, Pakistan in terms of naval bases or potential naval bases. I was hoping you would say something about possible introduction of Chinese Navy into the Persian Gulf in terms of protecting its oil purchases or whatever, and how such a possibility would, for example, they asked a question about European clashes with China already. That would certainly, if there was a Chinese naval presence in the Gulf, and if it was on a more, you might say, permanent basis, then what would you say? Would you have any comments to make about that?
I mean, as we heard from the representative from Pakistan, China will not build a base in Pakistan. However, I'm speaking, of course, I don't have any insider information whether China's planning to do this or not. But there's been a lot of rumors in the media, often quoting sources in government, that China is in discussions with various countries about potentially opening some sort of either military base or a dual-use port, or just being able to access one of the ports in the region, precisely for that use. This is what a few years back the media and academia was calling the String of Pearls initiative, right? So China getting a few bases around the Indian Ocean to try and control the area. And part of the rationale, as it was explained back then, was exactly that, to try and protect Chinese imports of energy and of goods coming in from the region and then through the Straits of Malacca and into China. That's also part of the attractiveness of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. It allows China to bypass a lot of the naval route that goes through Southeast Asia. If they get into Pakistan, then they go straight by land through the country and then into Chinese territory. So it's convenient, and that's the reasoning exactly. They are trying to protect their imports. I'm afraid I can't really comment on how exactly this would look like without knowing whether the base is happening. But if it were anything like we're seeing in Djibouti, for example, as far as I know, there aren't that many troops actually deployed in Djibouti. It's mostly, there are of course, but it's mostly operating as support for Chinese ships that are in the Gulf of Aden in the counter-piracy mission, and also for ships that get deployed anywhere else, either go around Africa or go all the way to Europe. They stop there. So it's sort of a bit of a base of operations, and we could definitely see something along those lines there. China deploying a few troops and then just making it a base for a naval mission, do some sort of counter-piracy or counter-terrorism along the region, and along the way protect its own energy and trade interests.
Any last questions in the remaining minute? Yes, sir?
When a country is producing most of its weapons itself, we have not been applying the purchasing power parity which we apply in the normal economics. So $150 billion vis-a-vis $650 billion, convert into purchasing power parity, what would that result in?
I'm sorry, I can't. I can't do that operation in my mind. I think you're probably referring to China's investment.
I'm talking of the military budget of China,
which
we normally, in the open source information, we call it as $150, $170 billion, vis-a-vis the US budget of $650. The most of the equipment are produced, the manpower costs. When we look at the purchasing power parity, which we apply in normal economics, and we consider China to be the largest economy in the world, look at how much, when you put that template onto defense, different equations can emerge.
Thank you for your comment. I don't think I can try and apply purchasing power parity right here off the top of my head. I'm afraid I can look into that and get back to you if you want. But I think no one's questioning the fact that the U.S. military budget is larger than the Chinese military budget. No one's questioning that, and that's also one of the reasons why when you look at the military balance, sure, we're seeing a shift, but there hasn't been a reversal.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, that's the end of it, but we have more than used your time and your expertise during this excellent seminar. I think 3 words that come to mind that I would use to describe the themes would be that we're looking at a personalized, politicized, and highly symbolic PLA. But of course, the range of questions that we've had today show that it's not just symbolic anymore, and we're looking at a increasingly global China that will have impacts across the globe. So thank you, Helena, for your talk, and thank you all for joining us.